I'm no tech genius, but I knew if I wanted my business to crush it, I needed a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost made it easy. I customized, optimized, and monetized everything exactly how I wanted with AI. In minutes, my site was up. I couldn't believe it. The search engine tools even helped me get more site visitors. Whatever your passion project is, you can set it up with Bluehost. With their 30-day money-back guarantee, what do you got to lose? Head to Bluehost.com. That's BLUEHOST.com to start now.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello everyone and welcome to a solo episode of A Cultural History of Canada. Mac is sick and away from his regular recording station. He's in Sydney right now, so he won't be joining me today for a brief discussion on a rather famous figure in Canada, although his fame is relatively recent compared to when his life was lived, mostly for political reasons. And I wanted to talk about Norman Bethune, and specifically talk about him in relation to an even more recent novel, which is by Dennis Bock, which came out in 2007 and is called The Communist's Daughter. I'll talk about what the novel entails a little bit later. But yeah, I just thought it would be interesting to spitball a little bit on Bethune's life. He's someone that I knew a little bit about before researching this episode. For example, there's a statue of him not far from where I went and did my undergraduate studies. So I would have been tangentially aware of him, right, and heard his name here and there, but he's never someone that I would have formally studied. And it was kind of interesting to look into his life. So for those of you who are less aware of the details of that, Bethune himself was born in Gravenhurst, Ontario. And from the sources that I read, he is apparently someone who showed very early on an independence of mind, being willing to study and look into the minutiae and details of the world around him, right? And this is a quality of his, I should say, that led him to study medicine at the University of Toronto, which, by the way, is also a place where they recognize him today, right? He also has a statue there. He has a few places named after him on the campus of the University of Toronto. He taught 1 year at Frontier College, and even early in his life, he served as a stretcher bearer in France. So all of these various moments, right, studying, teaching, actually practicing some form of medicine, both at home and internationally, would be very formative for him insofar as they would give him insight into various elements of the medical field, both on a theoretical and technical level, and in a more practical level, both internationally and nationally. And this would really inform his worldview going forward. Ultimately, he graduated in 1916, and from then he joined the Royal Navy, mostly because, it was wartime, and you do need medical personnel during war. Shocker. After the war, which was also a formative experience for him and one that he would continue delving into on a more deliberate basis throughout his life, as we'll get into, he went on to study pediatrics and surgery both in England and Scotland, right? Adding once again to his project, I guess, or ongoing life project of seeing how medicine and medical perspectives can change from one place to another and what can be integrated from a completely different location into what he would have called home. He did set up practice eventually in Detroit, right? But very quickly those plans dissipated and kind of went by the wayside because he developed rather severe tuberculosis and had to be hospitalized at a very young age. And this is where I'm going to stop and take my first break into first detour, I should say, into Bock's novel. Now, the novel itself is really interesting because it's framed as a series of letters, right, by Bethune himself to a daughter that doesn't exist. And so it becomes this whole dealing, right, or fictional dealing, I should say, by Bock, as he would have imagined Bethune to have about his legacy, both in the literalization of a daughter, but also in his medical legacy as a surgeon and field surgeon specifically. So it's a really interesting kind of approach, I think, that works really well for Bethune, who is demonstrated as a rather contemplative person, right, by the very nature of the letter as a medium. But I think Bock has done his research, and he really also emphasizes what some historians and researchers have demonstrated as Bethune's brashness and willingness to take risks. Right? So it's a delicate balance to have, but the novel is successful, I think, in demonstrating this duality. So for the tuberculosis, there's a section, I would say a little bit past halfway the novel, where Bethune describes the sanatorium that he was in while having tuberculosis. And I'm just going to read this paragraph, and I think, says a lot about the man and Bock's perspective on him. The Trudeau Sanatorium had been founded in 1884 by a doctor from New York named Edward Livingston Trudeau, and quickly recognized as one of the best of its kind. Trudeau had been drawn from New York to the Adirondacks by the promise of clear air and untouched forests. These, he thought, were the ideal climactic conditions to help heal the afflicted lungs of a TB patient. In October, I went there alone to place my name on the wait list, then headed north over the border to pass my days at the Calidore Sanatorium in Gravenhurst, Ontario. At the time, I was unable to sidestep the grim irony of returning to the sawdust town of my birth with the distinct possibility of dying there. My life, bookended by the narrow prospects of that sleepy, insular place, would prove deadeningly, pathetically inconsequential. I lay there, confined to a bed, writing letters to Francis, while waiting for a space to open at the Trudeau, never sure that I would go out into the world again. It was a misery, but the pained romantic and brooding poet in me relished the solitude. So even though I hadn't got quite there in the brief historical overview, when he talks about Francis, he's referring to his wife. But yeah, there's just so much to unpack in this passage. Just the general notion of what medicine was kind of transitioning into, right? When he mentions at the start of the paragraph, the promise of clean air and untouched forest as being some kind of healing, right? Which for some purposes can definitely work, right? Just actually being outside a highly polluted area can do a lot for you, though not necessarily for tuberculosis, as far as I know. But then to tie this notion of the promise of clean air and untouched forest back into Bethune's perspective on the world, which is, as he calls it, the pained romantic and brooding poet, is quite interesting, just as on a literary level. But I also wanted to point to the section in the middle of this paragraph where he addresses what he calls the grim irony of returning to the sawdust town of my birth, with the distinct possibility of dying there. So at this point in his life, I didn't write it down in my notes, but let's look it up real. This is going to be great podcasting material. Yes, this would have been in 1926. So he would have only been 36 at the time. So relatively young, actually quite young. And his awareness, or his keen sense of awareness of the proximity of death, is again something that I would argue drove him throughout most of the remainder of his life. As we're going to see, not long after he leaves the sanatorium, I guess spoiler for a man who's already dead, he does make it out alive. But he would go on to greater adventures, right, and always be in proximity with this kind of incessant ghost of death. And the irony of that for a doctor is something that I find very interesting to put front and center of this particular passage. So, as I mentioned, he would eventually be cured of his tuberculosis. His brooding poetic romanticism did not come to pass in the way that he necessarily imagined it. And once he was better, he moved to Montreal, and there he became a rather prominent chest surgeon. Hence why a statue of his exists in or near places like the Sir George Williams campus at Concordia. One of the things that would make him so prominent is that he would improve on and invent various medical instruments that would, improve the overall quality of the care that was given. So, for example, there was the Bethune rib shears, which is exactly as they sound, rib shears, except the way that he designed them and improved on them would make them much more efficient for fast action. You can look up an image of them on Google. They're exactly what you would expect. But this kind of innovation and desire to constantly improve and make the medical field better did ultimately lead him to become chief of thoracic surgery at the Hôpital du Sacré-Cœur, which is still around today. I don't know if they have anything in honor of him. And it's estimated that between 1929 and 1936, so in a period of only 7 years, Bethune invented or redesigned something like 12 a dozen medical or surgical instruments, and would write many dozen articles describing his innovations in thoracic technique. But despite this willingness to actually put his life and soul into this profession, don't let that fool you into thinking that he was not disillusioned and highly critical of surgical treatments and the medical field. Specifically, he was very concerned with socioeconomic aspects of disease, right, and medical care. We have to remember that at the time there was no socialized healthcare in Canada or anything like that. There were discussions of it, and Bethune would be one of those people that challenged his profession and proposed radical reforms of medical care and health services, such as universal health care, but it wasn't something that had been formally implemented. And this is something that would cause quite a rift in his professional world, as someone who wants to do well, but is also limited in many ways by the realities of the medical system in Canada as it was at the time. He would actually never see the institution of socialized healthcare and universal healthcare in Canada. Right, he would die before that would actually happen. But to give people a bit of perspective, by the early 1940s, this discussion was already happening on a provincial level in places like Saskatchewan. So it was relatively contemporary to him, but he was still a bit ahead of his time in being so vocal about it. As I mentioned earlier, Bethune was during this time also married to Frances Penny, who was a Scottish immigrant who had come over to Canada. And I only mention this because it's a relationship that does demonstrate another side of Bethune and his brashness, right? So you see this in his professional world, right, pushing for reforms that do mirror his political stances, which we'll get back to. Their relationship was tumultuous at best. They fought, divorced, remarried, and then divorced again. But something that I think Dennis Bock does quite well in his book is demonstrate that despite this tumultuous relationship, it's not a relationship that was solely based on mutual hatred, right? If that makes sense. And there's a passage about a dozen pages earlier from the first passage that I had read a few minutes ago that I think encapsulates this, where Bock, writing as Bethune, writes, I've been thinking lately about matrimony, mine to be precise, a strange preoccupation in the middle of a war. I have been thinking about you finding happiness with a good and patient man. Remember that he's writing to a fictional daughter. Does that mark me as sentimental? Well, so be it. I'll skip a bit. No union in life is as dear as marriage, and though I may have been more susceptible than most to the frailties of the heart, I still believe it. None of us is so different in that regard. That is our greatest resource, I think, eternal hope. Some basic truths bear repeating, and this is one of them. I can tell you that the mystery of our loves is the deepest mystery we have, the most beautiful and ennobling too, and the most deserving of our ceaseless energies and wonder. I discovered this when I was younger, that one failure might strengthen you for another. The name of the woman who helped me to become that better man your mother fell in love with was Frances Penny. She became my wife, and 2 times I left her, walking back into my lonely life. So what he's getting at here is this idea of imagining something greater and doing and acting on behalf of some greater ideal, abstract as it may be, right? Which is a very significant, I would say, element of a man of science, yeah? And this is one of the things that I really appreciate about Bock's text, right? Is that despite being a man of medicine and science and really embracing it as such, he still finds time to write things or to think of things like, I can tell you that the mystery of our loves is the deepest mystery we have, the most beautiful and ennobling too, which I think is another brick in this, I guess, wall, metaphorical wall, that is Norman Bethune, right, in this construction that we're slowly getting to. So out of all of the things that we've been discussing so far, the war, the oncoming Great Depression, right, as well as the difficulties of a healthcare system that actually can't provide for most of the people who need it for both socioeconomic reasons and just resource reasons, Bethune was increasingly affected by the suffering that he observed in Montreal and outside of Montreal. And this is something that pushed him to become much more politically active, right? And he would firm, as a lot of people were at the time, in his socialistic sympathies. Right? He would even visit the Soviet Union in 1935, which was just coming out of its civil war at the time, or more or less coming out of the Civil War. And it's after this that Bethune would fully decide to join the Communist Party of Canada, which was a difficult situation to say the least at the time. If you want to know more about it, I highly encourage that people listen to the episode that Mac and I did on this topic, must be about a year ago at this point. But it's something that at various points in Canada's history would have been straight up illegal to do. Right? And especially for an increasingly public figure like Bethune, it would have been rather difficult for him position-wise. Right? But ideally, that is what he, on an idealist level, that is what he was striving for, right? And he genuinely believed that it would help with many of the elements that he was fighting for. And, you know, it's something that makes sense. Universal health care was started by a relatively left-wing party in Canada, right? This whole idea of wanting to help the most downtrodden of society aligns with the ostensible aims of communism, right, as it was understood at the time. So this commitment, right, to such ideals, right, both socioeconomic and justice and etc., would actually bring him to participate in the Spanish Civil War, right? So a year after he visited the Soviet Union and joined the party, he would actually go fight alongside the Republicans against Franco's fascists. Now, this is where most people are somewhat aware of Bethune's innovations, right? It's certainly one of the most enduring innovations that he did. So during the Spanish Civil War, he established what we now call a mobile blood transfusion service, specifically for the Republican Army outside of Madrid. And it's really important to highlight this, I think, and it's why people mostly remember it, is because it really was the first of its kind. And it basically allowed him and other doctors to operate on what was essentially a 1,000-kilometer front, right? It's exactly as it sounds. It's a blood transfusion service that you can move around a lot more easily, right? It has fewer parts, it's much more lightweight, and it's extremely effective. Now, of course, it doesn't solve the problems of actually dealing with the conflict around you, but at least on that front, it really improves a lot of things for people like Bethune who were helping out during the Spanish Civil War. A decision which, on its own, actually did cause further strife, because when he returned to Canada in 1937 to raise money for the anti-fascist cause in Spain, he actually faced a lot of public criticism during a speaking tour to support the Republicans. Officially, Canada did not send volunteers or did not send people to the front during the Spanish Civil War. It was a time of depression, actually, and we'll remind people. So doing anything like this, and for political reasons also, it was a bit dicey. People were not necessarily in favor of this, right? But he stuck to it nonetheless, right? And again, this is one of the reasons why Bethune was less remembered or was pushed to the side, historically speaking, for quite a bit of time. But inventions like the mobile blood transfusion service did definitely keep him somewhat in the history books for a long time. And Bock alludes to this in his novelization, where he writes very early on in the book, well, journalists from England, Norway, and America had started coming around to see about the blood transfusion work that we were doing in Spain. And so he's kind of getting at this idea of intense international interest in his work, even if politically speaking, not great for a lot of people at the time. This whole idea of helping other countries who were facing war would continue, right, for literally the rest of his life, because there's not many years left to his life. So in 1938, Bethune would leave Spain and he would actually go to China for rather similar reasons than he went to Spain in the first place, except instead of fighting for the Republicans in Spain, he allied himself with the Communist Army, right, which was which was associated, of course, with Mao. And he actually served under fire with Mao's 8th Route Army, and performed surgery on wounded soldiers and civilians. And he would write of this time that Spain and China are part of the same battle. This is not Bock writing, this is actually Bethune who had this perception, right? And what he meant was fighting against fascism and for greater ideals, right? And this is where we'll turn to one of the last quotes that I have from Bock's book. One that I think is a little bit more complicated to unpack, but I think it's just as interesting. So this is a scene where Bethune is actually talking and having a conversation with Mao, and trying to explain to him the transfusion service that he created in Spain. So where is it here? Yeah. As I outlined the logistics of getting the idea off the ground, training staff, procuring equipment, and funding, a different side of the man, Mao, began to emerge. He was an eager student, a brilliant strategist who asked many questions. Cool and analytical in his thinking, he sometimes paused for long moments to consider something that had been said. I watched his mind working, his dark eyes moving between me and Jean in the depths of the cave. His questions were the very ones I'd asked myself when first setting up the unit in Spain, and even some I had not. His hands folded before him on the table remained perfectly still. We must take cultural realities into consideration, he said when talking of blood donations. His head nodded slowly. Such a thing is a very concept for people here. Perhaps not so for Europeans. Here it is bordering on witchery. So the reason why I highlight this passage is for two reasons. One, it really effectively demonstrates what Bethune's admiration for Mao was, right? As a political figure, of course. He didn't know what happened afterwards, but as a general and a strategist, he is demonstrated, at least in this novel, as having some kind of admiration for him. But it's interesting that last sentence at the end, right? Such a thing is a very foreign concept for people here. Perhaps not so for Europeans. Here it is bordering on witchery. And the only reason I highlight it is because we know from the rest of what I was talking about in the rest of the novel that it's not quite so. These were innovations in Europe as well. And so it creates this rather interesting parallel between, again, what we see as more civilized, quote unquote, civilized places in the world and quote unquote, right, witchcraft and uncivilized places in the world. And it's something that the novel kind of deconstructs interestingly by saying, well, no, this was novel regardless of where you were, which of course brings the two men even closer together in the context of the novel. Now, if we were to imagine this whole scenario in Bethune's life as a movie, for example, and we were creating a fictional character, this would be a moment in which he would reach the perhaps apotheosis of his career, right? Helping international struggles everywhere and innovating and so on. And maybe there would be a bit of a dip later in his life, but ultimately he would come out somewhat of a hero. What's, I guess, ironic is that Bethune would basically die within less than a year of having arrived in China, mostly by accident, because of an accident. He contracted septicemia and in 1939, and it led to a very, very quick death, which I guess returns to this whole idea of that I brought back at the beginning of the episode, of him seeing an irony of, coming back to the place of his birth and only finding death, right? In a sense, he was being reborn as a reformist and revolutionary, both in the medical field and in his political stances, only to be so close and indeed engage with death itself, both on the battlefield and in his own life. And for a long time, Bethune himself was less recognized here in Canada, despite having been born and raised here, than he was in China, right? History, as we know, would make it so that Mao's forces would win the war, the civil war that was going on in China, and Bethune would basically be elevated to a national hero. And Mao even wrote an elegy in honor of him, which you can find online. I'll link in the description below if people want to check it out. And I'll just read a little part of it. This is in the second paragraph. I'll read the last paragraph. Comrade Bethune and I met only once. Afterwards, he wrote me many letters, but I was busy, and I wrote him only one letter, and do not even know if he ever received it. I am deeply grieved over his death. Now we are all commemorating him, which shows how profoundly his spirit inspires everyone. We must all learn the spirit of absolute selflessness from him. With this spirit, everyone can be very useful to the people. A man's ability may be great or small, but if he has this spirit, he is already noble-minded and pure, a man of moral integrity and above vulgar interests, a man who is of value to the people. And yeah, I think that says a lot about how the man at least was perceived. So even though he was very well recognized, in China, because of that association with that whole situation, which ostensibly they were enemies of Canada and still are in many ways today, right? Because of political and economic affiliations, Bethune's synonymity, I guess, with China made him persona non grata in Canada. And for some decades, he was actually only one of the few Westerners, right, who were respected and admired by the Chinese. But slowly, like I said, his life has been, I guess, taken up again here. So I think that's all I had to say about him, about his life. I don't want to go on for too long just because I know these solo episodes can be a little bit more straightforward and less conversational, and you don't want to necessarily hear me talk for a full hour like this. But yeah, I do recommend that people read the novel that I've been kind of referencing here and there. It does demonstrate both a very interesting tension between history and memory, right? Because the letters that frame the narrative are inherently more subjective. And it complicates Bethune's historical record, right? So instead of a linear biography, we receive a personal and fragmented memory that's kind of colored with longing and self-justification and regret, right? Which is also demonstrated in this kind of imagined daughter as a symbol. But ultimately, it really creates this human figure, right? That becomes reflective, tender, and guilty, and even apologetic, which are qualities that are largely absent from the heroic myth that has been built in certain circles around him. So I'll leave it at that. If people do want to support the show, they can do so through Patreon or all those other things. And yeah, you can always reach out with an email if you have any questions or concerns. But if not, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming on the next episode. Thank you everyone for listening, and I'll catch you next time.